The world has changed massively while you've been trying to change it. Do you think you've changed it, or has it changed around you?
Well, I'm certain that I have been a part of that process of change, perhaps quite a small part, but together with many thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people, we certainly have changed the world. Uh, when
In
I was
what
growing,
way?
when I was growing up, apartheid was taken for granted. It's now history. Pinochet was ruling in Chile. He's now dead. Lots of things in the world have changed, and all for the better.
You are probably best known for direct action. Can you explain to me what it is? What does it mean to you?
Well, my inspirations for direct action are Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King. They were two extraordinary men who faced insurmountable odds in trying to overturn, first of all, British rule in India, and secondly, segregation in the deep south of the United States. They did initially try to work within the system, which I have also done. And it's always preferable to sit down and negotiate and to get a compromise and an agreement. But when that doesn't work, you either got to accept the status quo or do something a bit more challenging.
But
And,
direct
and they,
action,
they did it. They did it. They did it non-violently, peacefully, but also very, very successfully.
but direct action has always been misunderstood by the authorities because it's always been portrayed as a violent thing. Can you explain why you don't see it that way? Why you see it as non-violent?
Well, of course, direct action can be violent, and I don't agree with that. My activism has always been based upon the principle of non-violent direct action and civil disobedience. And in the 100 or more arrests I've endured, every single one was for an entirely peaceful protest. No one was harmed, no damage was caused. But I was prepared to get arrested to make a point about a grave injustice. A good example was, of course, the attempted citizen's arrest of President Mugabe of Zimbabwe, not once, but twice. The first time in London in 1999, when myself and colleagues from the LGBT group Outrage ambushed his motorcade and actually had him under arrest. And then the second time was in Brussels in 2001, when I tried to arrest him in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel. Now, on both those occasions, it was not about LGBT rights, even though he's a notorious homophobe. It was about the wider, broader human rights abuses, in particular, his authorization and condonement of torture of people in Zimbabwe.
So just talk me through what happened. I mean, as you come eye to eye with this man.
Well, what happened, for example, in the first attempt in London in 1999, I received a late night phone call informing me that President Mugabe had come to London on a private shopping trip, and he was staying at the St. James's Court Hotel near Victoria Station. Before I could make any further inquiries, the caller hung up, and I was left with a dilemma. Is this a hoax or is it genuine? I decided to assume it was genuine. So the next morning I contacted Amnesty International in London. I got a file about Mugabe's human rights abuses, in particular the case of the torture of these two journalists, which was the legal basis for his arrest. And then I phoned around people to try and get them to come along and help me have a go. I've never heard so many plausible excuses in my life. But understandably, I was really nervous. His bodyguards could be armed. So what happened is we lay in wait outside his hotel early in the morning, knowing at some point he'd have to come out. I brought with me a journalist, a photographer, and a video person, so that everything we did could be documented. And then just lay in wait. And eventually, Mugabe came out in a limousine. I scratched the top of my head to indicate to my colleagues that he was in the car, and they very courageously ran straight out in front of his speeding limousine, forcing it to halt about 6 inches from their legs. Then one of them ran behind the car, so it couldn't go forward, couldn't go back, and I ran from the side and opened the left-hand rear door.
And it was open.
Amazingly, it was unlocked. And then gently reached in and took Mugabe's arm and held out my other hand with a open palm to show I didn't have a weapon, and then said, President Mugabe, you're under arrest on charges of torture. Torture is a crime under international law. I am now summoning the police. You should have seen the look on his face. I mean, he is very dark-skinned, but a visible ashen pallor came across his face. His eyes popped, his jaw dropped. He recoiled in his seat, holding up his hands. He looked like a frightened 10-year-old kid. The
Well, he
bodyguard.
probably thought you were coming to kill him. I mean,
Well, I had the open palm, so I clearly didn't have a weapon. And the bodyguard in the back was, well, I'm sure he's probably ended up in prison because he recoiled in his seat as well and did nothing. So we summoned the police and we explained who was in the car. They were gobsmacked. The officer said, "You mean the president of Zimbabwe?" And we presented the documents, all the documentation for his lawful arrest and prosecution. And the police just knocked them out of our hands. We were eventually taken to Belgravia police station. We were facing a whole lot of charges, obstructing the highway, criminal damage, riot and affray, all trumped up charges. On the opening day of our trial, as soon as our defense team announced that we had a complete video of the entire episode and would show that 15 police officers were apparently intent on committing perjury, the case was dropped. We did not succeed in arresting President Mugabe, but the media coverage around the world about what we tried to do did raise awareness about his human rights abuses. And in the weeks after, I received thousands and thousands of emails in a period when not that many people in Zimbabwe had emails saying, thank heaven someone did something. We thought no one cared. So psychologically and emotionally, it was incredibly important for a lot of Zimbabwe people.
that was, I mean, it was a sincere act on your part, but it was obviously viewed by many people as a stunt. That you must have known this was never going to fly. You were going to end up being taken away by the police, and you must have thought that was pretty likely when you set out. And your protests have always sort of skirted this line, or of people saying, well, it's a Peter Tatchell stunt or it's a human rights protest. And in order for your protest to really work, you've got to try and keep people thinking Tatchell isn't a self-publicist. He's doing this for sincere reasons. How do you try and get that right so that people don't dismiss you as just as a self-publicist?
Well, of course, that same charge could be laid at every suffragette protest, every march by Gandhi, every act of civil disobedience by Martin Luther King. There are people who did say that these people are just self-publicists and narcissists and doing stunts. But their actions, which have inspired me, certainly did help raise public awareness about issues, and in many cases, actually change the law.
But where did this desire, though, to be an activist come from? I mean, when did you decide that you were going to try and change the world? As a teenager or a student or what?
My real passion as a young man was art and design, and that's where I began my working life as. But I had left school at 16 with no A-levels or anything. I came from a very deeply conservative working class family. Everything in our family revolved around the church.
This is in Australia?
This is in Australia.
Whereabouts?
In Melbourne.
Right.
So nothing prepared me for the human rights activism I've subsequently done for the last 51 years.
Why did you leave school so young? I mean, was it because they couldn't afford for you not to? Or?
Yeah, in those days, there was no National Health Service in Australia, and my mother had chronic life-threatening asthma. So a lot of our quite modest income anyway, my father was a factory worker, a lot of that income went on medical bills and hospital trips. So my parents needed me to go to work to earn money.
Were they political at all? I mean,
Not at all.
They taught you about the world?
Not at all. No, they were totally disinterested. Totally disinterested. So my first campaign was in 1967 against the death penalty, when an escaped prisoner was due to hang for having allegedly shot dead a warder during an escape. But the evidence against him was not conclusive. He was hanged anyway. And that made me a lifelong skeptic of authority. It led me to say, well, if people in power are prepared to hang a man with at least some reasonable doubt about his guilt, what else are they doing?
So did you have friends or a mentor, or who was helping you along this path, or was it all just coming from you?
I had no one.
So what's your explanation as to why this 15-year-old boy from a working class family in Australia suddenly started caring about these issues?
Well, it may have been partly to do, ironically, my parents' own very devout and quite fundamentalist Christianity. Um, the sort of things I took from Christianity were the idea of love thy neighbor as thyself, be a good Samaritan.
Social justice.
Yeah, I am my brother and sister's keeper. So I translated those ideas into the need for us to each take personal responsibility for our lives and what is happening around us.
And were you a regular Australian kid? Did you go to the beach? Did you surf?
Oh,
Did
yeah,
you
yeah,
do all
I
those
was,
sorts
I
of
was
things?
surfing fanatic. Yeah.
So did you think of Australia? I say this as somebody with lots of family in Australia. My wife's Australian. I mean, did you think Australia was sort of primitive in its thinking back then around issues of social justice, around the death penalty, around military action and all of those things? Did you think, God, this place is stuck in the 1950s?
Well, it was stuck in the
Yeah.
1950s, and we had our own version of McCarthyism. So I nearly lost my job, my first job, because I'd been seen by my boss at an anti-Vietnam War protest. I had to plead and grovel to get him to keep me on. But that was the kind of toxic atmosphere. If you supported liberal causes, you were a communist or you were aiding the communists.
Were you conscious of sort of wrestling with your sexuality at that time as well, at the same time?
Well, I didn't realize I was gay until I was 17. And then I just had an instant acceptance, amazingly, given my...
Just a moment.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in my parents' theology, homosexuality was up there with rape and murder, one of the worst possible sins. But at 17, it began to dawn on me that I might be gay. I had my first sex with a guy who I worked with. I remember lying back in bed with him and thinking to myself, well, if this is what gay is, I'm obviously gay, and it's wonderful. And I thought, the Bible has got it wrong, or the Christians have got it wrong. Christian teaching is supposed to be about sins because they cause harm to others. This didn't cause harm. This brought great joy to me and my partner, with whom I'm now still lifelong best friends.
Why do you think you found it so easy to get your head around, whereas so many others didn't in the same situation at the same time?
I'm not sure, but I guess, by this stage, I'd already been doing, 2 or more years of social activism and challenging and questioning the consensus. So that sort of made it easier. And, I never had any guilt or anxiety at all. From that moment onwards, I was totally relaxed, content, fulfilled, okay about being gay.
And did you think at that age, 17, that this was going to be your life, that you knew your life was going to be about trying to change the world?
No. Back in those days, when I was 17 in 1969 in Melbourne, Australia, there was no gay movement. There weren't even any gay helplines or counseling services. There was absolutely nothing. But I thought to myself, well, there's nothing now, but I want to make something. So I tried to set up an LGBT rights organization, but all my friends were too terrified. Most of them were somewhat older, and they said things like, what do you know? You're only 17, go away, you'll get us all arrested. So all I could do was write letters to newspapers or things like that.
What was the law in Australia in those days?
Homosexuality was totally illegal in the state of Victoria, punishable by several years imprisonment, and even...
At any age?
Yeah, and even compulsory enforced psychiatric treatment.
This is the late 60s?
Yeah.
So when did the law change?
Well, it changed different times in different states, but in the state of Victoria, it didn't change till 1981.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. But see, I didn't have a template. I didn't have mentors. I didn't have an LGBT movement to guide me. So I took as my template the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States. I saw that their ideals and values and methods as a very useful, practical way to advance LGBT rights. So in the absence of anything else, that was my template. That was the way I began my campaigning and have continued ever since. I remember also reasoning at 17, no one else had ever told me this, but I just worked out in my own mind, well, if Black Americans are an oppressed minority, then so are LGBT people. And we have the same claim for equality and social justice. And I reasoned that, given the experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement, that it would probably take about 50 years to win LGBT legal equality in countries like Australia, Britain, and the United States. And
You were right.
my guess was almost right. But that was a guess.
But do you think it's happened? I mean, Britain now thinks of itself as this socially liberal country where politicians proudly talk about, voting for gay marriage and wanting to change Britain's attitudes and how we're a totally different country to the one we were 20 years ago. Why do you think that's happened? Do you think it's happened because of campaigning, because of awareness raising, or do you think it's just been a natural march of progress, friendships, evolution?
Social change is never natural and happening of its own accord.
It had to be made to happen.
It has to be made to happen. And that's the same for women's rights, Black rights, working class rights, and the rights of LGBT people. I'm not saying that campaigning alone was the motor, but I think it was a very significant one. And I've operated both inside Parliament, working with MPs and governments, but also on the outside as well. And I think that combination of protest on the outside, mirrored by lobbying on the inside, is, as the suffragettes showed, very, very effective. So in 1992, the LGBT group Outrage, which I was involved in, we had a 6-month-long Equality Now campaign, the biggest, most sustained LGBT civil rights campaign in this country, and one of the biggest beyond the suffragettes of any recent modern history. We did a direct action every week for every 2 weeks for 6 months, and hundreds of people were arrested. I've got to say, it was almost unreported in the media. It was reported, but not on the scale that it should have been. But we systematically challenged each and every law. We confessed to committing crimes under these draconian Victorian-era legislations, and challenged the police to arrest us.
The public profile of Outrage was basically about this organisation that was going around outing people who were in the closet, and it was seen as an outrageous movement because you were, and you were accused of ruining people's lives, of breaking their human rights. Do you think you got it wrong at all? That whole campaign?
Well, first of all, outing was just a tiny, tiny fragment of the collectivity of what Outrage did over.
But it's what it was famous for at that time, isn't it?
Yeah. We never outed anyone because they were gay. It was because they were hypocrites and homophobes. If someone was privately gay, secretly gay, we didn't touch them. But public figures who condemned and attacked the gay community, who supported anti-gay laws, we gave them warning, and if they continued, we then named them.
How did you warn them?
Well, we looked privately, and we made public.
You'd send them a letter, or
and we made public statements as well. We said, if these people continue, like the Church of England bishops, if you continue to condemn LGBT people, if you continue to say that Parliament must maintain discrimination in law, despite your own homosexuality, you will be named.
Are there any regrets? Are there any ones that you think, oh, I'm not sure we quite got that one right?
No, because we were very, very cautious. We could have named 15 bishops, but we chose to only name 10 on the basis that in 5 of the cases, there was some degree of doubt or uncertainty. So we only named people who were absolutely cast iron assured were gay. And none of those bishops ever denied being gay. The positive consequence is that some of those bishops later on became great allies of the LGBT movement. It also prompted the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. George Carey, to set up the first official dialogue between the Church of England and the lesbian and gay Christian movement.
So do you think as a method to change the world, that one worked? Would you say that was a good one?
It was ethically justified, and it worked because it did reduce the homophobia of those people.
There were casualties, though, weren't there? I mean,
No.
effectively, in that
No.
there were lives that would have been ruined at that time.
No.
Maybe they were hypocrites,
Yeah.
but
No, none of those bishops' life was ruined.
can you be sure?
Well, I've spoken to a lot of them. In fact, some of them say, in retrospect, it was painful, meaning embarrassing at the time, but they feel better persons for it now. I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We actually helped change things for the better.
And do you think you were because your profile in those years was really quite bad, wasn't it? I mean, a lot of people hated you.
Yeah, I lived with death threats all the time,
Yeah.
and violent attacks upon my home, and even being physically assaulted in the street.
Yeah, and you were certainly the focus of hate in the media. I mean, the newspapers loathed you.
Yeah.
Do you think that was because they were just homophobic, or because you were a convenient target, or what do you think was really behind it?
I think I was deemed to be an uppity queer. I think there was homophobia behind a lot of it.
Because all of those newspaper editors, and would have had gay friends and gay members of the family and all the rest of it. I mean,
Possibly.
they can't all have just been driven from some fear of the gay community.
Well, I don't know, but there was one very famous newspaper columnist who said that I hear that some people say that Peter Tatchell should be killed. That wouldn't be a very bad thing. And this was in a national newspaper. So that was the kind of atmosphere there was. And yes, it was personally quite painful and difficult for me to cope with, psychologically and emotionally. It was tough. But I was motivated by my love and concern for victims of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. I wanted to defend them and thought that they, the victims, had to be defended by any peaceful means necessary.
I mean, clearly it was a very frightening time. And you seem, I've known you vaguely, I don't know, 25, 30 years. And I remember you then as sort of as quite a nervy man. You could come over as paranoid.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say paranoid, but I'd say nervous. Yeah.
But you would come over as quite afraid at times of what would happen to you.
For 20 or 30 years, from the Bermondsey by-election when I first came to public prominence in 1983, I had non-stop death threats and hate mail running into the thousands or tens of thousands every year. I was physically violently assaulted in that 30-year period over 300 times. Nearly all the teeth in my mouth are chipped and cracked and had to be reconstructed through restorative dentistry. I've been attacked with bottles, bricks, stones, iron bars, fists, boots. There's been over 50 attacks upon my flat, including 3 arson attempts and a bullet through the front door. There's been various periods when I've had to be under police armed guard. In the mid-1990s, there was a plot by the neo-Nazi group Combat 18 to kill me and 9 other prominent public figures. In the early 2000s, I had to have armed police protection over challenging the Jamaican reggae and dancehall singers who were advocating killing gays and lesbians. They sent a hitman here to kill me.
So, what effect does that have on your mental health? Living like
yeah, I've lived with post-traumatic stress disorder for many decades. Often, waking up with night terrors, reliving the violent attacks. And I'm so lucky that I haven't been seriously injured or even killed. The police and my doctors have said, you are one lucky man. You could have easily been killed in this period. And for me, it was like living through a low-level civil war. But then again, what spurred me on was my optimism and hope that things could change, my belief in the importance of the human rights campaigns I was doing, and also the knowledge that human rights defenders in other countries suffer far worse fates. If I had been in Russia or Iran or Saudi Arabia or Uganda, I almost certainly would be dead. So, their courage inspires me to keep going. And I've had my challenges and my setbacks, but nothing by comparison to what they've endured. And that inspiration is what drives me on.
In terms of changing public opinion, how important was it to have alongside the radical protesters like you, the cuddlier ones, the Ian McKellens, the household names saying, well, no, I'm gay too?
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very important. As I said, you need both.
You've got to cover all bases.
Yeah, you need the suffragettes and the suffragists, and they work in synergy.
And so
good cop, bad cop.
So what difference to that method has social media made? Because a lot of people now think a protest is a hashtag.
Yeah.
You know, that you can change the world on Twitter.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of social media campaigns can be effective, but you really need to get millions of signatures to make an impact. And you really have to target, that campaign to the right people. So the big campaign to get a statue for Millicent Fawcett in Parliament Square, or to get Jane Austen on the £10 note, those were driven initially in part by social media. And that was very effective, and it helped bring about those two positive changes. So I'm not against social media, it's fine, but sometimes it's not enough. When people in power won't listen, if they won't listen to an argument presented well, if they close their minds and hearts to reason and compassion, then sometimes you do have to force the issue by putting them under some kind of pressure. I think the great tragedy about the campaign against the Iraq War, which of course I supported and was involved in, was that it didn't have any financial leverage. It didn't have any leverage against the Blair government. Despite millions of people making it clear through vast numbers of protests that they did not support this war, the government went ahead anyway. Now, if there'd been some kind of leverage against that government, such as financial leverage, if millions of people had said, we're refusing to pay our tax, for example, that might have prompted a rethink.
Although
it certainly worked with the poll tax. With Margaret Thatcher, it wasn't the violent protests against the poll tax that brought down that awful law. It was the millions of people who either refused to pay the poll tax or delayed their payments and made the system unworkable. A classic example of non-violent direct action being successful.
But the irony of the Iraq war protests were that, yes, of course, they couldn't stop the Iraq war, but they've had a massive impact on Britain's foreign policy since.
Absolutely.
Because the fear of those protests, or rather the fear of the electoral impact of another unpopular war, has had a huge change on British foreign policy. Some people would say, for the worse, because it's made politicians terrified of intervention. Let's just talk about Labour for a second, because you wanted to be a Labour MP, you stood as a Labour candidate, but you were denounced by Michael Foot, the then Labour leader. You had a very, very high-profile fight to stand in 1983. You were very unpopular in sections of the Labour Party. And then you left Labour because the new Labour Party didn't stand for very much that you stood for, became a Green. Mm-hmm. Do you now look at Jeremy Corbyn and think, oh, I might go back?
Well, first of all, let me say, people often ask me, don't you wish that perhaps you'd been elected in 1983 as a Labour MP? And I say, well, of course. And I'm very disappointed and feel quite ashamed that I lost that election. I felt I let down myself, but more importantly, I let down Labour. People say, well, where would you be now? And I used to say, oh, probably I'd be a...
House of Lords.
No. If I'd been elected in 1983, I probably would have been a very passionate backbench MP like Jeremy Corbyn. Because Jeremy Corbyn is now leader of the Labour Party and hopefully the next Prime Minister. So, history has some weird turns.
Do you see him as a kindred spirit?
Yes. I mean, I've got some criticisms. Like, as I said, I'm very disappointed that he hasn't done more to push for humanitarian aid drops to civilian populations in Syria. I'm saddened that he is not yet supporting a fair voting system, a system of proportional representation, where the proportion of seats won by a party correspond roughly to the proportion of votes they get. And I'm quite saddened that he hasn't done more on what I call economic democracy. That is, making it mandatory for private companies and institutions like the National Health Service to have both employee and consumer representatives on the management boards to give a social impact, a social dimension to the deliberations of those institutions. But apart from that and one or two other things, I think Jeremy's got the right answers. I think his policies, renationalising the railways, closing tax havens and loopholes, these are all good policies which will benefit the British people. So I'm supporting him and hoping he does become Prime Minister.
Do you feel the gay rights struggle on which you've spent so much of your life is effectively won?
Well, in terms of formal legal equality, we have made huge progress. Just think about it. Until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. Yet here we are, less than 2 decades later, and we have some of the best laws in the world. That is an extraordinary, momentous process of social change. It is the fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history and possibly world history. Never have so many laws affecting a particular community been repealed in such a short space of time.
And do you believe it?
That's a huge tribute, not to me, but to the tens of thousands of LGBT people across the country who've been part of that process, and very importantly, our straight friends and allies. Without them, we could not have made this progress.
Do you believe it, though, when it comes to the prejudice, the underlying prejudice, the underlying gay hatred that still exists?
We are in a better place now in terms of public attitudes towards LGBT people, but still there's a hardcore minority. Still about a fifth of people in this country believe that homosexuality is mostly or always wrong. A fifth, that's a lot of people. Much less than in the past. What used to be 2/3 in the late 80s and early 90s. So it has gone way, way down. But, in our schools, nearly half of all LGBT kids are bullied in our schools because of their sexuality or their gender identity. Over 1 million people who are LGBT in this country have been victims of homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crimes. Often not just once, but 2, 3, or 4 times over their lives. So there's still work to do. And when you look at the global picture, of course, it's almost hardly begun. I mean, there are still 72 countries, 36 of them Commonwealth countries, that have a total prohibition on same-sex relations, with penalties ranging up to life imprisonment and even execution in 10 Muslim-majority states. That is just unconscionable in the 21st century. So I have never, ever seen LGBT rights purely from a British perspective. But I've always seen it as a global question, and I won't rest until LGBT people worldwide have the freedoms they deserve.
Do you think Labour is getting it right on trans people being able to, enter women-only shortlists and all that kind of thing? I mean, do you think the argument's going the right way?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm really pleased that Labour has taken on the trans issue. There's all this fuss about bathrooms and all these issues. What people have to focus on is the horrendous scale of hate and violence against trans people in this country and around the world, where trans people are being murdered for who they are, where the hatred and rejection they suffer leads to astronomically high levels of suicide and attempted suicide. Of young trans people, over half have attempted or contemplated suicide. Over half. That's truly, truly shocking. And I think, it's really important that we recognize the right of trans people to be who they are. Some people make all kinds of arguments, particularly some feminists, which I'm very surprised about. They say they're really men. This reduces gender to genitals, and that's absurd. Gender is about much more than genitals. It's about emotions, psychology, and mental states. And I think that the science shows that there are some differences between male and female brains, and that is almost certainly likely to be a component in a lot of people who have a trans identity, and that's their absolute human right. I think, when trans people are treated the way they are by some people on the progressive left, it strikes me as absurd. Back in the day, when I was young, the women's liberation movement used to say, biology is not destiny. Now they seem to be saying biology is destiny. If you're born with male genitals, you are a man, you'll always be a man. That to me is a very reductive and deterministic view, which doesn't take into account the real human suffering and feelings of trans people.
Well, we're coming to the end, but I just want to sort of put one, criticism to you as well, and see how, what your answer to it is. I mean, over the years, some people have said of Peter Tatchell, well, why doesn't he go and get a job? Why are we paying for the Peter Tatchells of this world to live in a council house at our expense to try and change our society? What's your answer to that?
Well, first of all, for 45 years, I worked unpaid. I never earned a penny. I lived in dire poverty. For more than 2 decades, I couldn't even afford to turn on the heating in winter. I had to live in my flat with a hat, woolly hat, 3 jumpers, 2 pairs of trousers, and big, thick boots. I don't want to brag or boast or want sympathy, but I did make some real personal sacrifices. I couldn't have holidays. I couldn't go to the cinema. Every penny I had went on campaigns. As regard my council flat, I've lived there almost 40 years. I've more than paid off the cost of that council flat. I refused to buy it, even though I could have bought it for £15,000. It's now worth over £320,000. I've made my sacrifice. I don't want thanks for it. I don't want pity. I don't want sympathy, but I've done my bit, and I will continue doing my bit, hopefully for about another 25 or 30 years. I think perhaps retiring at about 95 might be appropriate. I think I might deserve that. But until then, I intend to carry on, as someone described me as the Duracell activist. He goes on and on and on. And I'm sorry some people find it boring or offensive, but I believe passionately in human rights. And my motivation is very simple. I love other people. I love liberty, equality, justice, freedom. And those values are what drives me. And you may think I'm wrong, and maybe I am wrong, but I am following my conscience.
How do you feel about edging towards national treasure status? I mean, it's not far off, is it? I mean, you spent most of your life as a sort of a thorn in the side of the establishment. As you get older now, and as some of your battles are almost won, you're sort of edging towards national treasure.
Well,
does that worry you?
I don't want to be a national treasure. National treasures end up in glass boxes in museums, and I'm not ready for that. I don't want it even. I will continue to be a thorn in the side of the establishment as and when it's appropriate, not for its own sake, not for the sake of just being an awkward one, but where it's necessary. So I will fight the battles against injustice wherever I find them, perhaps imperfectly and with my own flaws, but I'm doing what I believe to be right. And that's all I think anybody can do.
Peter Tatchell, thank you very much indeed.